White Fragility and Its Impact on Australian Education by Jack Dolbel. The 2018 book White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo explores different aspects of the concept of white fragility and its role in perpetuating racism. At its core, the book outlines the impact of white people's defensiveness to being challenged on racism. It describes how the impact of this defensiveness is in fact not fragile, but rather functions as a kind of white racial control, making it difficult for people to challenge white people on their unaware assumptions and biases. As a result, most do not. This in turn keeps everybody in their place and protects the racial hierarchy. In exploring this idea, the book discusses some key concepts. Racial identity, the idea that all individuals have a racial identity, whether they are aware of it or not. Socialization, how individuals, regardless of their race, are socialized into racial hierarchies from a young age. Implicit bias refers to the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that can influence our actions and decisions. White privilege, the advantages and benefits that white people often enjoy in society simply because they are white. Structural racism. Racism is not just about individual attitudes and actions, but is deeply embedded in the structures and institutions of society. And accountability. The need for white individuals to take responsibility for their role in perpetuating racism and to actively work towards dismantling it. While the book grapples with multiple concepts, the big takeaway for me was the concept of which the book was titled, White Fragility. Prior to reading, I'd never heard of white fragility, and thus it intrigued me. It refers to the defensiveness and discomfort that many white people feel when confronted with discussions about race and racism. This avoidance perpetuates racist practices and ideas. This is similar to how social and cultural capital perpetuate themselves, remembering that those with more social and cultural capital continue to gain more due to their privileged position. This idea works the same way that white fragility works to perpetuate the racial hierarchy. The longer white people avoid difficult conversations and acceptance of responsibility, the longer the status of people's race in society is maintained. As a white male, I have realized my unfair and privileged position in society. I came to this realization through various unit readings over my time studying. Most notable readings for me included Gilo Whitaker, McIntosh, and Candola. However, it was this book that first made me realize my direct involvement in maintaining these unfair systems, structures, and hierarchies. Proving the relevance of this situation Robin DiAngelo describes. While reading the book, I noticed myself becoming defensive about certain topics. When I caught myself doing this, it made me realize the significance of this topic, and that if I can portray this negative behavior while literally reading a book about it, then I must be displaying this behavior in many other racially challenging situations, and so too must be countless other white people. Another aha moment for me was watching and reflecting on the 2023 Disney movie The Little Mermaid. I remember the controversy when it first released, that Ariel, the protagonist, had darker skin and that this was not reflective of the original animation. At the time I mocked Disney for being too woke and that it was unnecessary to do such a thing. However, looking back, this attitude is the exact white fragility that DiAngelo describes, and that backwards beliefs like this is what is blocking positive societal progress. This unit, EST305 Socially Inclusive Pedagogy, explored theoretical ideas and concepts of inclusion and how they pertain to inclusive pedagogy and practices. The primary concepts were that of normalization, deficit discourse, neoliberalism, inclusive education, and social justice. DiAngelo touches on all of these ideas, sometimes without mentioning them directly. Australia has a long and fragile history of racism and racist policies in education. In 1937, Australia implemented hardline assimilation policies. This development significantly impacted Indigenous education as it saw the removal of thousands of mixed-race Indigenous and European children from their homelands and families. While this is no longer practiced, racism and exclusion are still present throughout education in Australia, disproportionately affecting First Nations people. Once again, white fragility and the ideas shared by Robin DiAngelo's book play a significant role. Ignorance, poor language inclusionary practices, and leadership positions dominated by white people all result in the oppression of First Nations people and the continuation of a systemically racist education system. It is easy to say that Australia is leagues ahead of many other countries regarding inclusion, particularly racial inclusion. However, ideas and sentiments like this are often expressed by those who do not experience racism. Whether this is due to white fragility or ignorance, this mindset maintains the racial hierarchy and prevents progress. One significant factor of exclusion that is not well addressed in Australian schools is the plight of English as a second language or dialect students. These students are often excluded on multiple levels, and as the book White Fragility points out, this is largely due to those in charge and with power to make change, not knowing the severity and what it feels like to be in this situation. Leadership, especially in the education space, is predominantly made up of white Australians. From a personal observation, I've been a student at 3 different schools and worked at 6 schools in the Northern Territory. The principals of all 9 of these schools were white Australian during my time with them. The lack of diverse representation at the leadership level of Australian schools undoubtedly has an impact on inclusion and exclusion. White dominance at the leadership level, lack of support and understanding for English as an additional language or dialect students, deficit discourse, and the other theoretical concepts of inclusion and exclusion all interplay and create a difficult and systemically racist education environment, especially for First Nations people. Robin DiAngelo's book highlights this and provides a name to one of the most significant factors working to maintain the social hierarchy as well as enable racism and exclusion. She calls it white fragility. Thank you for listening.